Okay, well, let us begin. Thank you for being with us. My name is Danny Robbins. I'm the director of the Nonprofit Administration Program. With us today, we have Arthur Frazier, the professor for our Economics and Nonprofit course, Nora Lally, our Public Policy and Program Evaluation professor, and Mary Paxton, the professor of our Nonprofits and Advocacy course. Hannah, could you please go to the next slide? Next one. As I said, I'm the director of the program. I'm also a professor of practice. I teach some years, 4 other years classes in the program. I've spent my entire career in the field, 30 years this year somehow. I've been the executive director of 2 domestic violence shelters and two boys and girls clubs. I was the first director of the Women's Center at Case. And I've spent actually 12 years this month somehow also as a coach and planning and governance consultant. And I use pronouns he, her, and hers. Hannah? The questions I plan to ask, and if I'm squinting, it's because I'm on a small laptop and I can't see that well. So what is a nonprofit? What counts as a nonprofit? Why do nonprofits exist? In other words, what's the goal? What are nonprofits allowed and not allowed to do? Who owns a nonprofit? The difference between a C3 and a C4, or most of the other Cs actually. If nonprofits are business, the answer is yes. How donations come in, and then what's going on in the field that will impact our future as a sector. But before I jump on, what questions do you have? You can put them in the chat or you could ask them out loud. There aren't that many of us on the call. Hearing none and seeing none, I will leave the door open for that. So if you have questions, jump on in when you do or put them in the chat. Hannah, next slide, please. So nonprofits are more than you might think. There are hospitals. Now, hospitals are tricky because sometimes they're nonprofits and sometimes they're for-profits and sometimes they're run by the government. But nonprofits are hospitals, universities, same. Sometimes they're nonprofits, sometimes they're state institutions, sometimes they're for-profits. Religious institutions, exclusively nonprofits. Associations, charities, social services, art, environment, education, anything you would think of as providing service to the community. Policy groups, think tanks, research institutions, political groups, unions or nonprofits, foundations, service organizations, Elks, Lions, Kiwanis, sororities and fraternities, sports clubs, and even internet platform and websites like Wikipedia and Mozilla are nonprofits. Hannah, thank you. Nonprofits serve a purpose. They serve a purpose, they meet a need, they address an issue. The board represents the community as owners and income is retained, meaning nobody gets paid out. It's not used to benefit private interest. It is the case that people get salaries, but they don't get paid shares or the money doesn't get distributed to the board members. The money stays and it gets reinvested in the mission. It may or may not be a charity. All nonprofits are not charities. All charities are nonprofits. Charities are 501c3s. They accept tax-deductible donations and they have to pass a public support test. Nonprofit does not mean the agency loses money or even has to break even. There's some nonprofits that make significant money every year. Nonprofit is a tax status and charitable is a distinction under that status. As one of my friends in Columbus likes to say, nonprofit is a tax status, not a goal. Thank you. Nationally, there's 1.5 million nonprofits. 1.1 million of them are charitable, so about 70%. They have annual revenues of $1.74 trillion, and that's up considerably because those numbers are from 2013. They contributed 5.3% of the GDP in 2014. And Ohio, the numbers are higher, lower obviously than the national, but higher as far as our portion in the GDP. So 60,000 nonprofits in Ohio, 60% of them are 501c3s. We employ up to 11.6%, so 12% of the state's workforce works in a nonprofit in Ohio. We generate $103 billion in annual revenue. So characteristics of a nonprofit, they're organized, right? They're private. Nonprofit distributing, like I said, the money doesn't go to the shareholders, it gets reinvested in the mission. They are self-governing and they are non-compulsory. No one can make you join a nonprofit. If you have questions, please jump on in. We can take them as we go, or we can take them at the end. All nonprofits are tax exempt, meaning that they don't pay certain taxes. They don't pay sales tax. They don't pay corporate income tax. So whatever money, whatever income the nonprofit has retained at the end of the year, they're not paying taxes on that. They often, go back a little, they often don't pay property taxes. Only charities can accept tax deductible gifts. Now you can go. Thanks, Anna. So there's a few different ways to give to nonprofits. When people generally think about giving, they think about individual giving. So there's major donor gifts, meaning large gifts, and then there's annual gifts, smaller gifts that people give every year. Major donors may also give large gifts every year, but we tend to split them in the field. Major donors are whatever the top 10% of your donation pool is. So if you have donations generally in the $50 to $250 category, but you every so often get some $500 and $1,000 gifts, those would be your major donors. It scales up from there. It would apply regardless of the size of the charity, the top 10%. So there's common ground is saying they pay property taxes. If we do, should we go through, sorry, it went away, through a process to file for an exemption? You can, certainly. It depends on how you got it. Property tax is one of the things that is not always guaranteed, and it depends on the county and the organization. But you should certainly try. Absolutely. Okay. There's special events, meaning you go to something, even if it's something that's virtual, right? There's a time, you show up. Maybe it's a gala, maybe it's a run, maybe it's I just totally lost it. Gala run or something else. But there's whatever event that raises money for the charity. And then there's grants. There's grants from the government, there's grants from foundations, and there's all types of foundations. And I'll tell you about what they are in a minute. And then there's corporate foundations, corporate grants, which generally run from corporate foundations, but don't always. Any questions before I continue? Hearing none. There's also different types of giving. There's project or program giving, meaning that I can give money to one particular program. So when I ran the Boys and Girls Clubs of the Western Reserve in Akron, we had 4 different sites and we had 5 different programs. So 5 programs running at 4 different sites. You could give money for the Smart Girls program at the Ravenna Club, right? And then we would have to track that money as restricted giving that only went to the Smart Girls program at the Ravenna Club. You could also just give money for the Ravenna Club. You could also give money in 2021 for a 2022 gift, and we would track that as restricted until 2022. So there's lots of different ways to restrict gift and to specify your giving. What nonprofit execs prefer, of course, and development directors across the country, is general operating giving. General operating means you get a check in the mail and I can use it for whatever I want. So I can use it to pay the electric bill, I can use it to buy toilet paper, I can use it to buy staff, I can use it to pay rent. General operating is an unrestricted giving. Then there's capital giving. Capital giving counts as anything to buy something big. So if I'm giving money to build a new building, if I'm giving money to buy a school bus, if I'm giving money to buy a camp, anything that's big tends to be capital. If we need an HVAC system, that counts as capital. And then there's endowment giving, which is literally a transfer of wealth from your account to the organization's account. It could be at a community foundation, it could be at a financial organization, but it's restricted giving that sits in an account. Would a discount received count as an in-kind donation as in a service discount? Yeah, I haven't gotten to get in-kind, so give me a minute and let me get to that, and then I'll answer your question. And if I don't, come back. Then there's planned gifts, which count as sometimes people think it means like a gift I pledged, like I promise I'm going to give you $5,000 every year for the next 3 years. That's called a pledge, not a planned gift. A planned gift is a gift that I promise to make after I die. So if I wrote the Boys and Girls Club in my will, which I did, then that's a planned gift. A bequest is a planned gift. So when you look at Giving USA numbers, there's individual giving and there's bequests. Bequests were money that were given after a donor died. Then there's donor advised funds, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, and in-kind gifts, back to Ken at Common Ground. In-kind gifts is a gift that is not cash or something that can easily be turned into cash like stocks. In-kind gifts are gifts of services or stuff. It's interesting. I actually haven't seen it done, Ken, that a discount would count as an in-kind gift, but I guess it could. You would just have to prove that it was actually a discount. So occasionally, like if I do consulting work for clients, I will write like a 50% discount in, and then reduce it, by 50% for whatever reason. I don't do it very often, but every so often I do. But I don't claim that on my taxes. But I suppose if your auditor said you could count that as an in-kind, you could. That would be a good question for your auditor. My solid answer is maybe, Ken. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. And then there's restricted and unrestricted, as I already mentioned. Restricted is any restrictions on the gift, right? So if it's only for one program, if it's only for one time frame, if it's only for one county, if it's only for one set of kids, if it's only for anything, that's restricted. And we have to track it as nonprofit leaders to the penny. So whatever we accepted money for, we need to be able to spend the money on what we said we would pay for it, which is why you should not accept money you can't spend. And then there's unrestricted, and unrestricted is general operating that we can do whatever we want with, which is our favorite kind of money, right, Mary?
Hey, Danny.
All right, Connor.
Question about restricted versus unrestricted. So are nonprofits more likely to see unrestricted donations rather than restricted, or does it depend on the nonprofit? Like, what are donors more likely to give?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you that we were more likely to see unrestricted, but we're not. We're more likely to see restricted gifts because there's a history in this country of not wanting to pay for overhead. And many of us have been working for a long time to get over the overhead thing because it doesn't make any sense, right? Like you would never go into a store and say, like, I'm willing to pay for my coffee, but I'm not willing to pay for the barista's time or the rent or anything like that. So even though you're charging $5, I only want to pay $3, right? Even though that's exactly what happens in a nonprofit, right? The program costs whatever the program costs, but then there's still other people that work there, and there's rent, and there's utilities, and there's lots of other things. But we've evolved to be more focused on restricted giving, and I think it's to all of our detriment, but it's real. Good question. Bad answer. All right, Hannah, keep going. Unless there's more questions in the chat. Oh, okay. Nope. All right, so there's a few different kinds of nonprofits. There's associations and civic institutions. There's foundations, charities, religious institutions, unions, fraternal organizations, and other. Next, please. So voluntary associations is anything that you join that has a membership fee to a large degree, not necessarily the zoo or city club, but other things, Kiwanis, service clubs, things like that, in which membership is non-compulsory. There's an identifiable way to distinguish members from non-members. That identifiable way is usually whether you paid or not. They are self-governing. They are non-commercial. They're not usually charities. They're usually 501c4s. Voluntary associations exist to serve their members. Charities exist to serve the community. Next slide, please. 501c4s are not tax deductible. In certain cases, they can be public record. If you give to certain 501c3s, your name will be listed and it will be shared. They have no restrictions on lobbying, but the lobbying has to be related to the exempt purpose, and political campaigns can't be their primary activity. So there's a lot of lobbying that you can do that has nothing to do with electioneering, which is about political campaigns and supporting individual candidates. But, and while 4s are allowed to do that, it can't be their primary activity. Next slide, please. Mary's going to get into more of this in the advocacy section. Charities receive support from a large number of donors or the government. sometimes hopefully both. They provide direct services and spend most of what they bring in. Not all of what they bring in, but most of what they bring in. 501c3s also include foundations, private foundations, maybe one or a few donors. They are not permitted to engage in lobbying. They have minimum spending requirements of investment returns, generally 5%. And then there's also religious institutions that are charities. In all of the above, board members do not usually get paid, and they frankly shouldn't get paid, with a couple of exceptions. Research organizations often pay their board members, and family foundations often pay their board members. Community-based nonprofits don't and shouldn't pay their board members. Religious institutions are automatically entitled to a tax deduction, and they are exempted from reporting requirements. So while you would have to work to start a nonprofit and get a bunch of things approved by the government, you could start a church tomorrow and automatically be able to accept donations and not have to submit tax papers ever. Which is why it's so hard to find information about how church operations. There's a few different kind of foundations, and they're really pretty different. There's grant-making foundations, billion-dollar Rockefeller, small family foundations. It really is what most people think of when they think of foundations. There's operating foundations, which are really just charities that had a foundation and were started under that umbrella. Historically, they did both raising money and sometimes granting to the community. So they're called operating foundations, but they don't quite operate the way grant-making foundations operate, but sometimes they do. There's corporate foundations, which may be funded by endowment, but also may just be funded by annual proceeds. There's a community foundation, which pools resources in a specified location. Cleveland, where we're sitting right now, is the birthplace of the community foundation. And then there's government-sponsored foundations, which you will almost never come across, and they're created by public charter. Then there's donor-advised funds. So donor-advised funds are new-ish, and they are a pretty big source of controversy right now in the sector. They allow for a donor to give money under the auspices of a community foundation or a sponsoring organization such as Fidelity Charitable without setting up an actual foundation. So if you sold a business, inherited a lot of money, you were looking for an immediate and significant tax break, you could set up a donor advised fund in any of a number of places, including a couple charities. In the last few years, some actual charities have started running donor advised funds with the idea that part of it will come to their organization and part of it will be granted in the community. It is the largest recipient of charitable dollars for several years running. Charitable gifts still hovered about 2%, and several years running, the top 5 recipients of charitable dollars, not 5 of the top 10 have been donor advised funds. Fidelity Charitable at the top. You get an immediate deduction for the full gift. It was intended to be, and is still referred to as, the democratization of philanthropy, to not a little skepticism by some of us. You can recommend charities to support, and it's usually followed, but it's not always followed. So if you have money at a community foundation, or you have money at a Jewish foundation, or you have money at a Catholic foundation, they are unlikely to fund organizations that are in conflict with their values. And because the donor only advises and the sponsoring organization holds the assets, all you get to do is advise. You won't be able to make them give a gift to that you want if they don't want. There are a few rules that go along with it. You can't use it to pay pledges. You can't use it to buy something or for the private benefit of a donor. So you can't buy theater tickets with it, and you can't buy gala tickets with it. There's no distribution requirement, which is why some of us are skeptical. So the money can sit there in perpetuity until you decide where to advise the institution to give your money. And there's no obligation to disclose donors. So unlike a foundation that has to report to whom they give, donor advised funds can give to whomever they want. They can be named for whoever you want, and you would never know as a charity from whom you're getting a gift. Next slide, please. Students always have a ton of questions about donor advised funds, so I'm just going to pause there for a second, take a sip of water, and see if you have questions. There was a period of time a couple of years ago that the students were like, donor advised funds, and then we were off to the races for like an hour. So, all right, no questions? I'll keep going. There's other types of foundations. There's cooperatives, mutual societies, self-help groups. They often count as nonprofits as well. This is what a general nonprofit looks like. They're all not going to look like this, but many of them look like this. What they all will look like is the board. The board is always at the top. There is no nonprofit chart that does not have the board at the top. The board hires the executive director. The executive director hires everybody else. There is usually, but not always, 3 lines in a nonprofit. Those 3 lines are development, meaning you raise money, programs, operations, and then finance, HR, operations, administrative operations over there. There's sometimes a volunteer coordinator or a volunteer services, but not always. If you've worked in the field for a long time, you've noticed that it's very hard to move across those 3 lines. So it may be that you spent your career in development, but you decided you want to be an exec. Like, how do you learn about operations and how do you learn about finance? And we have not always done a great job in this sector of training up our staff that are coming up behind us. So if you are interested in ascending to the executive director position, I encourage you to talk to your executive about how to train up and what professional development opportunities are available. And then, of course, I encourage you to join our program and come get your master's so that you will learn all of these pieces. Next slide, Hannah. The board at the top of the chart has 5 jobs. Their job is to set the mission, vision, and strategic direction for the organization, to hire, support, and evaluate, and when necessary, fire the executive director, to serve as the fiduciary responsible agent, to set policy, and to secure resources, which we generally think of as fundraising, but is a little bit bigger. The executive leader literally does everything else, either in concert with the board or on their own. So here's what the exec does. And we use the term CEO and president and executive director synonymously in this field, which drives us crazy, but is still true. So it's the same job regardless of what it's called. Whoever is the chief executive is the chief executive regardless of what title they actually hold. They are responsible for executing the overall direction of the organization in support of its mission and goals. They provide leadership and direction to the staff in carrying out their roles. They inspire, engage, live the organizational values, and own the culture. So if you're running an organization and you're not happy with the culture, that's on you to fix. And if you're interviewing for an organization, you need to be very clear that the values that you hold match the values that the organization holds. The exec is usually the face of the, the exec is always the face of the organization in the community and usually the spokesperson. The spokesperson is by policy, meaning the board has to vote on a policy of who the spokesperson is. I will tell you, in a crisis is not the day to figure out who speaks for your organization. So if you don't have a policy, I encourage you to get a policy as soon as possible on who speaks for the organization, because the last thing you want is the media going down the list and calling every board member and every staff member and having them say, I don't know. What you want them to say is, this person is the spokesperson, can I have them return your call? The executive director also manages up. They guide, support, and serve the board of directors in establishing goals, developing policies, attaining and allocating resources, and implementing a strategic plan. They are the ex officio on all committees. People tend to think ex officio means non-voting member, but it doesn't. Under Robert's Rules of Order, ex officio means that you are on the committee or on the board because of the role. So if you're the exec, you're on every committee, and whether you show up or not, it's another story, but you're on every committee, and the minute you're not the exec, you're not on any committees. Next slide, please. So who can do what? Charitable nonprofits can accept tax-deductible donations, and they have to comply with legal restrictions on lobbying. They are allowed to lobby, as Mary is going to tell you, but there are some restrictions. Social welfare organizations, 501c4s, are permitted to engage in lobbying without limits, as long as it is consistent with their purpose and of advancing social welfare. They can engage in political activities, including the endorsement of candidates, which charities are never allowed to do. Charities are never allowed to endorse candidates, but 501c4s can, as long as it is not their primary purpose. They can act like super PACs, which we're going to talk about in a minute, without being subject to the disclosure requirements of super PACs. They are not allowed to contribute directly to a candidate's campaign, and they cannot accept tax-deductible donations. 501c3s often work with 4s. The 3s offer programs and address the charitable mission, and the 4 engage in advocacy that includes lobbying. 501c5s and 6s are treated similarly to 4s in terms of lobbying. Political action committees are permitted to engage in partisan political activity, but face limitations on their lobbying. Super PACs. I just had a long conversation with my husband about super PACs. So super PACs were created after the Citizens United Supreme Court case. They can raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, associations, and individuals. Unlimited. They can spend unlimited sums to overtly advocate for or against political candidates. They can't collude with those candidates, but the word collude is pretty squishy, and it's a pretty high bar to get to it. Unlike traditional PACs, super PACs are prohibited from donating money directly to political candidates, and their spending must not be coordinated with the candidate they benefit. That's where the colluding comes in. Super PACs are required to report their donations to the Federal Election Committee on a monthly or semi-annual basis, up to the super PAC in off years and monthly in the year of the election. This is really important and shocking in its volume. As of September 2021, so last month, 2,276 groups organized as super PACs have reported total receipts of that's a billion, right? 3 billion, trillion. Which is it? I'm going to go with trillion because I think the 427 is billion. No, it's billion. Sorry. I don't know, whatever it is. It's a huge amount of money. Huge. Arthur, you're the economist. Which is it, billion or trillion?
That's a billion, Danny.
Thank you.
3.4 billion.
Thank you. So almost $3.5 billion, and total independent expenditures of just over $2 billion in 1 year. 1 year, lots of money running. Tana? So we have a lot of issues that are facing us as a sector, and I'm just going to touch on them, and then I'm going to hand it off to our next professor. The Johnson Amendment is on the table. The idea of the Johnson Amendment is to support candidates from the pulpit. So it actually applies to the entire sector, but when most people talk about it, they talk about it as electioneering from the pulpit by a pastor or religious leader. It's illegal right now. Not that it doesn't happen. There's plenty of churches that are electioneering, but they're not supposed to be, and it's illegal under the law right now. And we'll see where that goes. There's some issues around for-profit or not. Same service, different status, right? We talked about hospitals, hospice, schools. There's some argument that there's an unfair advantage to being a nonprofit. Same service, not the same tax payment. So in Chicago a couple of years ago, nonprofits used to get free water, and then they started talking about maybe we shouldn't be giving them free water anymore. So there's some issues there. There's tax policy. Taxing nonprofits is on the table in some communities. Taxing endowments is on the table in some communities. Tax credit for charitable giving directly reduces the amount of taxes you owe, same regardless of the income tax bracket of the giver. So is it fair that a larger giver gets a larger tax break than a smaller giver for the same donation? And then who decides what's a hate group? Right. So the IRS got in trouble a few years ago for allegedly picking on hate groups, specific organizations and defining them as hate groups. But you have to decide, what's the goal and who decides, and who's going to decide what's a hate group. We have to talk about the impact of PACs and super PACs on elections. That was a lot of money, billions of dollars rolling in 1 year, changes things. There's issues of police funding, justice, and the sector. There's significant issues of the whiteness of nonprofit boards and nonprofit leaders. Charitable deduction, should it be based on community need or donor preference as it is now? Does it subsidize the wealthy's pet projects? If it does, is that a problem? And then big philanthropy. Are big philanthropists perpetuating what they purport to want to alleviate? And then my favorite, donor advised funds, the democratization of philanthropy or warehousing money. And then finally, the lasting impact of COVID, which none of us know at this point. Is that the end of my program, Hannah? Yes, it is. All right, well, and does anyone have any final questions before I hand it over to Arthur Frazier? Hearing none, take it away, Arthur.
All right, thank you, Danny. Thank you very much. My topic is why should nonprofit managers and social entrepreneurs study economics? And when we look at what the relationship here, when we talk about nonprofits and the private sector, one of the things we look at here is we talk about what economics is when we talk about how nonprofit managers can apply these principles. We look at economics as being a social science, and what that means is that we have unlimited wants. Okay, so we have unlimited wants and desires in our society, but we only have so much to go around. So if we talk about resources here, we only have so much land, so much labor, so much capital, and also entrepreneurial ability. So the issue here when we talk about social science is how do we allocate that and how do we decide who gets what? So that turns into what becomes an economizing problem, because we have to decide basically who makes that decision. So that's where nonprofits can come in to help with that decision making, because in many situations, for-profits, they don't have that incentive to maybe solve some social issues that maybe nonprofits would be able to fill that void. So we look at this issue here and we talk about how decisions must be made. So we talk about households, we talk about firms, and we also talk about governments, how these decisions must be made and under that economizing problem or under conditions of scarcity. So that's when we look at the principles of economics, that's the foundation of it. How do we make that decision? Who makes those decisions? Because we're always constantly dealing with these constraints when we look at unlimited wants and scarce resources. Now, how do we allocate those resources? Okay, because again, we have these constraints. So we talk about markets. So markets, when we look at from an economic standpoint, we define markets, we have this interaction. So typically you have buyers and sellers, they come into the market. Buyers come into the market, they're looking for goods and services. Sellers come into the market and they're looking to sell their goods and services. So you have this interaction here where eventually what you want to come out of that is a price that's agreeable to both buyers and sellers. You have this concept called equilibrium. And so you have this situation where that comes together in the market. But the issue here is that particularly if you assume that you have what's called in economics, you have this perfectly competitive market where you have like many buyers and many sellers. So they're all making these independent decisions. And if you take all these independent decisions together and you have price as that mechanism, you have that market. And again, the motivation there is you have what's called want satisfying behavior in that situation. You have buyers that want to satisfy their needs. Another way of looking at that is utility, and sellers come in and want to satisfy that need. They have a profit motive. So you have that coming together. Now governments are different. Governments are not in business to make a profit. What governments are doing in this situation when they allocate resources, they're basically looking at this concept here through transfer payments. And they have these expenditures and they're able to provide for those services through taxation. All right, so that's how they're able to provide services such as unemployment, disability, Social Security, Medicare. They provide those services. And that's the local, state, federal. Those are all considered governments from an economic perspective. Now, also the government acts as a referee because we have this market system. Many times it's not fair. So we have the government acting as a referee to work with the market system to make sure people who are not able to participate because they're not producing, they can still participate. So the government acts as a referee also to make sure that the markets are not concentrated in the hands of a few firms. So that would be considered a monopoly or an oligopoly, where you just have a few firms controlling the whole market, which can stifle competition and that can impact economic growth. So you see that as well as the government in that function, and also developing rules here and how to operate in that market environment. Now, if we take that a step further, so we see voluntary institutions. And so we see that, like Danny was talking about, you see these nonprofit institutions and you see these foundations. These groups can voluntarily participate, and what they can do here is they can accumulate these resources, these individuals, these nonprofit organizations, and they can turn around and redistribute those resources to maybe satisfy needs that the for-profit sector, they don't have the incentive to solve. So you might see universities, or you might see different organizations that might fulfill a need that the for-profit sector, they don't have the incentive to do it because they don't see a profit in it. So that's where you see your voluntary institutions. And then you see your other institutions here. There could be some other types of actions that that you might see here that might have direct altruism, where you see individuals, they might take action here to maybe help individuals who might have individuals who might be recovering addicts, or there might be situations where you might have people who are maybe have incarcerated and trying to rehabilitate them. So you have those issues where other institutions that are non-market, they might be involved. So one of the main aspects here when we look at economics and how these principles can be applied, we look at the idea here of a social enterprise. So when we look at social enterprise, it's almost like a quasi business, but basically what social enterprise does, the emphasis is not on profits. Even though it can make a profit under the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, we have what we're called L3Cs as social enterprises, and they can be a quasi-limited liability company, and they can have those principles of a for-profit, but their overall goal here is to advance a community, a community agenda, or so to speak, or a some type of social need is not being met. So that's what you're looking at with a social enterprise there. So they have the characteristics, so to speak, of a nonprofit. They can earn a profit, but at the same time, their overall goal here, impact, to be considered a L3C organization. One of the guidelines here, if we look at the Treasury Department, it must have a charitable educational purpose, should be formed specifically to advance that purpose, and it must have a primary purpose other than profit sharing, and it can have no legislative or political purpose. So when we have a social enterprise, that can be not a organization that can benefit from, if we look at some of the economic principles there. So if we look at, again, social enterprises, if we're looking for traditional nonprofits, again, it could be a complement to other for-profit activities if it advances a mission that's not being fulfilled entirely by for-profit. So it can assist when you look at traditional nonprofits in that regard. Now, new startups, if we look at nonprofits and for-profits, we look at the role social enterprises can play there. It can give entrepreneurs this incentive or ability to have a social impact and financial sustainability into the organization's DNA from the outset. So it can have that mission from an overall impact here of providing new startups and for-profits with an incentive to meet a social need, and at the same time, giving it some sustainability, because it can make some profit, but again, the overall goal is to be an educational or charitable mission there. Now, for traditional businesses, we can look at the initiatives here. Traditional for-profit businesses, they can have a partnership. They can integrate these social enterprises with their business operations. Also, as I said a few minutes ago, continue to meet that need, that social mission, but at the same time, knowing that they can make a minimal profit in the process. So it's almost like a win-win situation when traditional businesses embrace social enterprises. So how do economists think? Generally, and I know one person told me a few years ago, if you look at the study of economics, it's a dismal science, but one of the things you look at here is we usually assume, classical economists assume people are rational, which means that you have all the information in front of you, you make the best decisions, and whatever that situation is, you have perfect information. At the end of the day, everybody's happy. That's so far from the truth. That, when we look at economics, we're solving problems. You're looking at problems, and normally what you try to do here is you start off with a foundation that you believe people are rational, and then you move away from that. You know, people behave in situations that satisfies their wants and their needs, which is a more like behavioral economics, which is more of a realistic view of it. But the idea here is when you see classical economics and you study it in the beginning of your coursework, you make this assumption that people have all the information and they're going to make the best decision always, all the time, under the circumstances. And that's why you're always going to have equilibrium. That's what people, traditionally, what people think. And another way we extend this, we say that people choose their preferred alternative from those available. So this assumption, if A is preferred to B, B is preferred to C, then A is preferred to C, is like a logical progression. So if we extend that, we make the assumption that the rational person acts out of their own interest, not being selfish in a sense, but they act out satisfying their own, what we call is called want satisfying behavior, or it's a way that you satisfy your utility because you're trying to achieve your best outcome given the information that you have. And that's, and classical economists believe that that's a rational or a logical way of looking at it. And so we extend that to donors. The idea here of donors prefer, they have that want satisfying behavior, so they're gonna give. They're gonna have that satisfaction of, I feel good when I give to an organization. I'm satisfying my utility if I give to a certain organization that I'm interested in. That's one of the issues if we look at rational behavior, not being selfish, but acting to satisfy their utility. Now, another aspect here, when we look at classical economists, the idea here is efficiency, and that's one of the driving forces when we look at, for example, supply and demand. When they come together, you have that idea here that you have efficiency. So one of the things we talk about when you have efficiency, your maximum benefit here, you have what's called allocative and productive efficiency. And the idea here is that when you're at that level, that means that you have for example, you might have a buyer that receives maximum utility when they receive a good or service. You have a seller that gets maximum utility when they put a good or service on the market. So when we look at these terms, for example, if you have productive efficiency from a producer standpoint, what you're doing is I'm producing the goods at the lowest average total cost. So I'm happy because I can produce this good at a lowest average total cost. As a buyer, you have allocative efficiency when you have a situation where I'm willing to pay more for this good, but I only have to pay less. So let's say you like tea, and you're saying to yourself, as the equilibrium price of tea is $3, but you're saying to yourself, I would pay $6 for this tea. You get a benefit of $3. So that's like allocative efficiency. So we put that together. You have allocative efficiency because that tells us as economists that you're using your resources, you're using your land, your labor, your capital, your entrepreneurial ability in a way to benefit society when you have maximum efficiency there. So that's what economists, how do we get to that point where you have maximum efficiency where society is benefiting from the use of your resources? And that's where nonprofits can play a major role there, because we're all striving to reach that maximum utility. Maybe for-profits might not be willing to go that far because they want more market share, for example, and they don't have the incentive to maybe lower their price because they want to earn a profit. And that's where nonprofits can fill that goal when we strive for efficiency. Also, we have this issue of equity. One of the issues when I first talked about earlier about the rational person, classical economists historically were not really concerned with equity because classical economists believe that if you had all the information that you needed to make a decision, you had all the information, you know exactly what the price is, you know exactly what the quantity is, there's no need for equity, because as a firm, all your business, all your revenue, you're not going to have inventory because you're selling it. From a producer, from a consumer standpoint, you should never be without a job. If you are without a job, all you have to do is go to your employer and lower and say, I will work for less. So employer will hire you. The firm will say, if the price is too high, I'll lower the price. So we have this idea that classical economists believe we have flexible prices and flexible wages. That was the idea. The Great Depression took away that myth because the Great Depression taught us that you have rigid prices don't go down, and wages don't go down. When there's a downturn or when there's a recession, employers just lay you off. So that's what the equity issue came into play here. So how do we distribute resources fairly? Now, that becomes an issue here when we talk about this concept of equity, because what is considered fair? Okay, what's right or what's wrong? All right, and that becomes politically and ethically challenging when we talk about this notion of fairness, because one political group or one ethical organization might say that, hey, I think if we look at what just happened here in the past year here with the pandemic, for example, there were some groups that said, hey, if you go out of business, that's just, the classical economists will say, you're out of business, that's it, you had a good run. If a person's unemployed, they might say that, well, you have to go out and cut the yard or rake leaves or something to make some money. But then others, when we look at the pandemic, when the government started sending out stimulus checks, for example, that was the government's response to say, okay, we're going to deal with equity here with the society, because we realized that this pandemic hit our whole world. And we think it's more fair to send out stimulus checks to people who have lost their job. We think it's fair to extend unemployment for another 3 months after the state unemployment benefits are exhausted. So that's when we look at from an economic standpoint, because again, we go back to that concept. We have unlimited wants and limited resources, and there's only so much to go around. So we have to look at, from an economic standpoint, we want the typical idea is from our standpoint, even our country, we don't distribute resources fairly. We have if you look at your upper 20% versus our lower 20%, the upper 20% has more than 50% of the income, and your lower 20% has about between 3 and 4% of the income. So that's a problem there with distribution. All right, so we look at how can we make that better? And again, that's where nonprofits can play a role with that concept. So we have what's called horizontal equity. So we look at horizontal equity, and how we define that is if you look at how people are treated the same, if you look at income, class, age, what degree are these individuals treated the same? Okay, so how are these individuals? And that's something that we look at. If you're in the same income bracket, or if we're in the same age bracket, or class, or whatever that is, how are you treated? That's horizontal equity. Now, vertical equity, how is there, what degree do we have this distribution of rewards or burdens among different classes of individuals? So if we have an upper 20% and a lower 20%, who's sharing the burden of or who's sharing the rewards when we look at vertical equity? So one of the things that we look at from an economic standpoint is, for example, we look at tax burdens. It depends on, and a concept we talk about is elasticity, how sensitive we are to prices. If we look at the tax burden, it depends on, as a consumer, if you are in a situation where you don't have any close substitutes. For example, gasoline, if there's a gasoline tax and there's no close substitutes for gasoline, if the price goes up, you still need gasoline. If the price goes down, you still need it. But what happens when that burden's apportioned, normally that falls on people who tend to need their jobs because they're driving to work and they need that transportation. Another example, if you look at vertical equity, if you look at your wage, if you look at FICA, for example, FICA is supposed to be shared equally among the employer and employee, but the tax burden falls more so on the employee because the employer has more flexibility in who they hire, and the employee needs their job more than the employer needs that employee. So we see those situations where vertical equity, that can be a situation where we look at, again, we look at our society where we do not have an equal distribution among our 20 percentiles in terms of income. So vertical equity is a way, as economists, how you research that to see what can be done when you have burdens maybe falling more so on people in the lower income bracket than you have in the upper income bracket. Facets of horizontal and vertical equity that are relevant to nonprofits. Now we have equity of endowments. So we have, not all of us start the same in life. Okay, that's just a reality of living. We do not start the same. We're not at this, in the race of life, we do not all start at the same block. So some people start off better in life, some people have better endowments, and some people have worse endowments. That's just the world we live in. Now we have equity of process. So that's another issue that you look at from economics. We look at it, is the process fair or are the same for all participants? For example, you look at the criminal justice system. There tends to be, we have this issue here, tends to be a, if you look at African-American males, for example, they tend to receive harsher sentences than white American males for the same crime. That's an issue. We look at equity of process. Equity of outcomes is the degree to which differential resources are provided to different groups so they can achieve fair final outcomes. Again, these are issues that nonprofits can look at from an economic perspective, looking at the principles of economics, because again, nonprofits can fit that need where maybe socially it's not on the radar. So nonprofits, if you're armed with these economic, we look at horizontal and vertical equity, for example, you can fulfill those needs which might not be on the radar, that maybe policymakers don't want to make that decision because of maybe they might fear political reprisals or anything like that. But these are three key factors if we look at horizontal and vertical equity that nonprofits can really take a role here. Taking these considerations and how you interact with the community. So we look at political and management issues that confront nonprofit leaders and public officials, often require grappling with trade-offs between efficiency and equity. And that's what I talked about earlier. When you're talking about efficiency, you're looking at, and one of the fundamental questions when we talk about productivity and economics, one of the foundational principles is we have what are the fundamental questions that every economic, whatever society you're in, whether it be democratic, whether it be communist, whether it be socialism, or whatever that political makeup or that government might be, you ask these three fundamental economic questions is, what are we going to produce? How are we going to produce it? And who's going to get the output? So we have these three fundamental economic questions. What's going to be produced? How is it going to be produced? And who is going to get the output? So now when we look at for-profits and versus nonprofits, you have these trade-offs, and these are called opportunity costs. They're opportunity costs because we look at, we must make decisions under conditions of scarcity. We must make these decisions. So when we do that, we have trade-offs. All right, because we have limited resources, we make a decision, and then that means we forego our next best opportunity or next best decision. We forego that. So that means if we look at our third component here, who gets the output, that's when we get efficiency. Efficiency says those who get the output are those who are willing and able to get the output. That's what classical economists say about efficiency. Those who are willing and able will get the output. We'll produce it, we'll decide how to produce it, and then who gets the output? Those who are willing and able. Now, the problem with that is that not everyone's willing and able, and it could be a variety of reasons. It could be you lost your job, it could be you're now retired, it could be you're disabled, you're mentally not able to produce. And from a classical standpoint, that will leave you out. But then that's where equity comes in, where the government realizes that not everyone is able to obtain the output by production. So that's what we talked about earlier with a government function there with transfer payments, providing, for example, disability, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. That's where the equity function comes in. Now, also, that's where the nonprofits can come in as well when we look at equity, because, for example, equity can be positive in this sense. So we see, let's say, for example, you have laws that say that you must have access, you must have wheelchair available access to get into a facility. You must have ramps to get into a facility. Now, that ensures equal treatment of people who might be physically handicapped that might have a job. So let's say you're a computer operator, but you're wheelchair bound. That facility must provide access for you. And that means that that's equal treatment of individuals who might be physically challenged. All right, so that's one way of benefiting the overall community when you have an equity function, where classical economists might say, well, we don't have laws like that, so therefore you can't produce, so therefore you're out of the economic picture for consumption. That would be efficiency, but equity says we must have access to public facilities, you must have parking spaces for people that are handicapped, because that provides equal treatment there, or the opportunity for equal treatment. And then we look at the second one here. For example, there might be nonprofit postal rates that might be inefficient way to allocate resources, because the idea here, if we talk about subsidies there, that might be biased towards nonprofit organizations where you might not be providing that same subsidy to lower the per unit production costs of for-profits. However, the goal with that would be that if you have a nonprofit that has that incentive, so when we talk about subsidies that lowers your per unit production costs, now nonprofits have other resources now they can go into the community. They can help that soup kitchen. You can help a battered women's shelter. Or you can help these organizations that might want to hire convicts who have been released from prison, and you want to give them a second chance. So when you have those subsidies there, that can help as we move towards equity. A conclusion. Managers and nonprofit leaders can utilize the tools of economics. Again, the ways you can do this, the major ways, policy level. If you want to interact or challenge some government actions that can affect your nonprofit, just having these tools available, because they know how to analyze policies from an economic standpoint, So nonprofit managers and your leaders can also benefit because you can meet your challenges of your nonprofit, your goals and objectives, and you're talking the same language as these policyholders are. So that could help in that regard, because they're using economic foundational tools as well. Even if they're not efficient using them, they're still using them. So that's something that you could have in your toolbox as well, and how you interact and advance your causes. And also from a managerial standpoint, if you're a nonprofit manager, and then just use the conceptual principles. All right, if you're running your business, your nonprofit, or if you're a social enterprise, you'll be able to notice, you can monitor, what are my average total costs? How can I maximize my efficiency here? What type of price can I set for a plate here if I'm running a soup kitchen? What price per plate can I set here and get to a point where I can understand the resource implications of my decisions? So those are the things that nonprofits can really benefit from, and just utilizing those tools. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good job, Arthur. I'm going to hand it off to Nora. Take it away, Nora.
Fantastic. Thank you. Hi, I'm Nora Lally. Not so long ago, a graduate of John Carroll myself, and have spent most of my career in and around and connected to public policy, program implementation and evaluation. So I am excited to be here today to talk about it a little bit more. Next slide, please. So when we talk about public policy, there's probably a million different definitions. So we're just going to start with one basic understanding of what it is as we move the conversation forward. So it's a government response to a problem or issue. And it comes to life in many forms, sometimes through regulations, sometimes through laws, sometimes through how resources are allocated, and sometimes through silence. Sometimes, when nothing is said, that also is a way that policy is set. It involves a diverse array of stakeholders, everyone from elected officials to policy wonks, to members of the community, to individuals who do this work on a day-to-day basis through advocacy organizations, coalitions, and of course, nonprofit organizations. It's also important to know that public policy is set and evaluated and created in an ongoing way that is often, let's call it, slow moving. This is not typically an enterprise or activity that has a quick turnaround time. There's a lot of deliberation. There's a lot of economic theory and application, and it is really like the air you breathe when you are doing policy, is that policy work is ongoing, even if you don't necessarily know it. Next slide, please. So it is nice to think of public policy in this circular, very organized way, which I think, if we were being real, these balls, these circles would be bouncing all over the place all the time. A little bit more like pinball, possibly, than like this nice circle, but we'll, just for point of discussion and clarification, we'll walk through them, starting at the top about how the process might look in an ideal situation. So the first thing is, what's the issue? Like, what's the problem? What are we trying to solve? When Danny had on her slide the list of current issues facing nonprofits, that would be the process of identifying an issue. Those are all things that are in the public policy mix because they have an impact on the people in the society, and the government has a role in making decisions about them. So the first part is issue identification. Then there's the super fun period, and I'm not even kidding when I say this, is the policy research and analysis. They're really digging in to see what's the current thinking on this, what's happened before, where is this policy now, where was this policy 5 years ago, why was this policy in the same place now as it was 5 years ago, just really looking at all kinds of data, all kinds of partners, all kinds of collaboration to understand what came before this related to this policy, so that you can understand what the policy options are. From that research and analysis, you get the also fun part of generating policy solutions and alternatives. Okay, this is where we are now. This is the issue. This is what we know came before us. What are some other options? How can we be doing this better? What is a different way we can handle this situation to get to the outcome that we want? So having those thoughts about different ways to do it is another next step, and always doing that in consultation with not just other thinkers and other research organizations, but really particularly with people who are feeling the impact of the policy itself. The idea of nothing about us without us, the idea of lived expertise, having not just a passing reference or one survey that people filled out, but really being integrally involved in policy recommendations, with the idea that people who have experienced a situation have a huge insight into what is needed and what works. For example, I do a lot of work in housing and homelessness. So we know that programs that serve people who experience homelessness that haven't talked really to people about what their experience of homelessness was like, or what solutions would work with them, end up with a lot of programming or options that no one's taking advantage of. And sometimes they're like, I don't understand. Why is no one coming? Like, well, you didn't really talk to the people who were who have the experience, or who would be utilizing the program, who are interested in the policy, to see that their perspective. So that consultation piece is really important, key to success. From all of that, you develop policy proposals, you move them on up through the process, then of course the policy is implemented, and then it is monitored and evaluated. So that is not even like 10,000 foot, that's probably like what it looks like from the moon when you're looking down at the policy analysis process, because all of those pieces have other component pieces to them. But I wanted to give you a basic, very high level look at what it looks like. So then the actual analysis piece of what the policy analysis looks like, if we know how policy is developed back in that big circle, then we can conceive of policy analysis happening in this smaller square, I think it's a square fashion, which is similar, but a little bit layered down. We can look at, we're going to define the problem. So again, what are we talking about? What's the issue that we're talking about? Now that we're really digging into policy analysis, we want to determine the criteria against which we're going to evaluate it. How do we know what is a good policy recommendation? What are the things we're going to value related to that policy? Are we going to value it based on equity? Are we going to be looking at efficiency? Are we going to be looking at whether or not it's actually possible, whether or not we can really implement it, whether or not it's something that's really feasible? And are we going to be looking at cost as one of the measures? Spoiler alert, we're always looking at cost as one of the measures, but we're also evaluating it based on other criteria. Connor, did you have your hand up, or did I make that up?
I did. Thank you. I had a question about consultation that you mentioned in the last slide. And this is a more specific question, but I know you spent a long time at HUD, and I was wondering what consultation looked like there and how you got input.
So that is a great question. I can tell you, when I was at HUD, consultation looked like a nice idea that no one knew how to do. And it was like, oh, consultation is a thing you all should do. Like, we're gonna like HUD through its program, essentially push the requirement down to say, hey, you all should be doing this. Tell us that you did it. That's gonna take the requirement. I would say in the past year, HUD partners, nonprofits, that have pushed back and said, well, that's interesting, HUD, how are you doing that? So called them to the table to do it. So now how HUD is doing it is they've changed how they're hiring. Some of the criteria about who's hiring, like experience in lieu of education criteria is one they've done it to actually get staffing. They've done it through who they partner with as far as advocacy organizations, making sure that those organizations also are truly living the expertise, truly including the people who lived expertise, and they're also subcontracting. They really, so HUD has staff, but then HUD has this whole world of I call them technical assistance providers, who are contracted to really do the, like, let me explain all these regulations and let me help set policy. So HUD has really focused on paying for those kinds of consultation services for people with lived experience. So thankfully, I can give you a good report on that. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have been like, they're working on it. They're really trying. But now I feel comfortable in saying that they're really moving forward with actually doing it in a significant way.
Thanks.
Thank you. So evaluation criteria are important to know what you're measuring the policy against. And then looking at what are alternatives. Okay, so this is what, one recommendation of what we should do. What are other options? And then always looking at the pluses and minuses of each when you're doing that step number 4, which is the evaluation, because there's no, these are all hard questions with no easy or perfect answers. So it's important when doing policy evaluation to be honest about what the positive impacts are, but also what some of the downsides are, so that the decision can be made with a breadth of information available, rather than trying to steer the outcome based on only providing the good stuff or only providing the bad stuff. So it's important to be able to set out the full story so that the decisions can be made with as much information as possible. Through all that process, the policy is selected and then implemented. So again, that is a linear way of thinking about a process that is happening in a multitude of ways at a multitude of times. And sometimes it's through this very formal process. Sometimes it's more like remembering, like, I remember 5 years ago when we had this policy about this, and you're pulling old things. So it's more of a patchwork maybe than a process. And of course, there's often all kinds of dynamics involved, not the least of which is politics, which can have a whole other influence into the process. But that's a basic evaluation, like overview, sketch. Let's call it a sketch of the process. Does public policy analysis matter to nonprofit organizations? I bet you can guess that the answer is yes. Yes, it does. Let's talk about why it is. So there's all kinds of reasons, like Danny and Arthur already laid out, but it's really important for nonprofits to recognize that they do exist in this environment of public policy. You can't have a mission and be trying to achieve a goal without being a part of some public policy discussions. So it's important to understand that public policy is vital to achieving what a nonprofit's mission is, and also understanding the impact on clients. So understanding what policies are happening, not just relative to your mission even, but also how public policy is impacting the particular people you're working with, like, those the allocations through the recent funding from government, those have a huge impact on people and how their day-to-day life functions. So hugely impactful if you're working with people who frequently are underemployed or unemployed, a huge impact when the subsidies increased and then also when they stopped. So being aware of those kinds of ebbs and flows of policy and how they impact people can be hugely impactful on those who you are serving. If people are needing to resources for food assistance, when as often happens, discussions about food resources being cut, that has a huge impact on just the day-to-day life of the people who you're working with, and sometimes even people that you're employing. So it's important to know that. It's also important to understand public policy from the specific impact that it has on a nonprofit in general, which is mostly related to tax policy. Are there changes in the tax code that have to do with the functioning of our nonprofit organization? Now I think there's also a lot of HR issues that are policy related to COVID that I think we're all trying to figure out. Is a mask mandate a thing I have to do? Is a vaccine requirement a thing I have to do? A lot of that stuff it impacts nonprofit organizations. So being aware of it and then being a part of the conversation is really important. Also important to be a part of public policy so you can prepare for and then understand what happens when policy is made. Is there's often the things that you're like, ooh, that's not what I thought I wanted to happen with that policy, and that creates an unintended consequence. So being able to prepare for that kind of situation. So like an unintended consequence of the COVID shutdown, schools closing, people working from home, was the recognition of not everyone has access to broadband or even a computer. So that, understanding the policy implications and then trying to stay ahead of it, or if you can't always stay ahead of it, at least be ready to jump and respond to it, to be able to say, okay, like this is now a need that we need. How can we connect resources to what that need is based on what we now know is this hole that has, that's probably always been there. We just never really knew about it. But now that this policy has impacted that, now we have to jump in and try to help out with that situation. Public policy analysis also really, I think, as a nonprofit organization, helps build your organizational expertise and influence. I think feels similar to what Arthur said, if you can talk like an economist and you can talk about policy, it just raises your, I'm going to say value, although that's not quite the right word, but it causes people within the community to say, hey, they know what they're talking about. They have good things to say. They're knowledgeable. They're not just spouting out sound bites. They've done some work. They know how this mechanism works. I'm going to ask them questions, or I'm going to invite them to this conversation. It gets you invited to conversations. It gets you invited to the conversations after the meeting, which I find are always the really important ones, like the ones where everyone else has left. And there's a few people who are kind of hanging on, talking about the really nitty gritty stuff. Those are the kinds of conversations that you can be involved in. And it just opens up partnerships. It really is great generative thinking. It increases your credibility within knowing that you are an expert about the organization that is associated with your mission. And also, as we know that nonprofits, we're here growing unapologetic social justice leaders, you have to, in order to advocate for change, you have to have a knowledge base on which to do that and have recommendations that are sound and thoughtful and will have the greatest impact while meeting the criteria that you're striving for. So it is important to be a part of the conversation for those reasons also. How can you do that? Nonprofits have there's so much going on already. Like, you're going to give me one more thing, Nora, one more thing I have to do. That is not possible. I cannot do it. Yes, you can, because you're not doing it alone. There's so many very active, very resourced, very intelligent coalitions, working groups, and membership organizations that are already doing this work. So by joining them, you can be part of public policy analysis. There's also, there's so much information that it can become overwhelming, but once you find a few trusted sources, and always make sure to check in with them, that can be a little bit more of a manageable way to know what's current, what recommendations are happening, to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening. Always a good idea to review the budget documents of entities that fund you, city, county, state, federal, because that is really, a government can say a million things about what their priorities are, but what they fund is really showing you what their priorities are. So taking the time to dig through those budget documents can be a wealth of information, both about projections and then actuals. Those are some interesting reading to really keep track of how your issues you care about are being funded by various government bodies. If it feels like you can't dedicate specific part of an FTE of staff to do this, although I definitely recommend that. If you can't, this is a great learning opportunity for interns, also a great opportunity for volunteers who kind of feel like, I want to be involved, but I don't really know what to do. That kind of, they're looking for something that maybe is more of lighter touch volunteering, or doesn't, it allows possibly for a remote option to build that into your methodology, your organization. The priority of public policy and analyzing what's out there is important. There's a lot of words I just said. I'm going to pause to see if anyone has questions. Okay, hearing none. I will move on to this other handy visual I have that completely oversimplifies a very complex process. So this is after a public policy decision is made. This visual is meant to walk through how that policy gets implemented. So because you don't want me to sing that Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law, I'm just a bill, we will use this instead. So the congressional bodies write the bill, the president approves the bill, there's a happy ceremony, possibly in the Rose Garden, things are signed. The bill, that law then is put into US code, and then it is the process of taking the code, the law, and putting it into regulation, where things really get interesting, and also where nonprofits have an opportunity to become involved. The first opportunity is if you see, well, during the writing of the bill, there's public hearings. So that is an opportunity to be able to give insight and recommendations. But I'm going to talk more about the next one, which is on the next slide. And it is found at number 7, number 5. So the law is signed. Then someone has to say, okay, what do we do now? How does this actually work? So that is generally called the rulemaking process or the regulation making process, which happens at the federal level through the various departments. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Education, the environmental, through the EPA. Those, the members of cabinet are the ones who get the fun work of writing the rules, and which are essentially become the playbooks, the rules of the road for how that particular law is going to be implemented. So what happens, the magical thing that happens at number 7 is that proposed rule gets published in a document that's called the Federal Register. So there is an opportunity when things are published in the Federal Register to make comment on those implementing regulations, to say, this makes sense, we like this is impossible, this would never work, this is in contrast with that, to really tear it apart to point out things that don't work, to make suggestions for things that might work. So while that comment making process might also seem very dry or not quite as obviously tied to the mission of an organization, if we again go back to our understanding of public policy just as the air we breathe, that it is impacting us even when we don't know it, that this is the opportunity to really be able to share our voice, share our insights, our learning, our expertise, our knowledge about various implementing regulations so we can do the best that we can, the most that we can, to see that they're implemented in a way that works for the people who we serve, the people we work with, as well as our organization. Next slide. After implementation, there is the evaluation process, which happens both at a policy level and at an organization level for any program that's implemented. There are, I only listed 4 here, but there are also a multitude of ways to look at program evaluation to see whether or not the program is meeting the goals that it was set out to meet, and then what needs to be fixed. I think often organizations, governments, whoever is afraid, sometimes you're like, I don't want to look at it anymore. Like, we did it, we passed the law, we did the regulation, now just let it go. We're, I'm gonna like cross my fingers and hope that it's doing what it was supposed to be doing. That's not a great approach. What we really should be doing is actual strategic evaluation so that we can make improvements and we can make sure we are always being as close as possible to the goal we wanted to achieve. There's various focus you can use when doing an evaluation. A particular one that I think a lot more organizations are realizing right now is the racial equity impact analysis. Like, how is what we're doing impacting people of different backgrounds and in different ways? So in housing, this looks a lot like, oh, if my program was always to just fund the same amount of rental assistance to people across the board, well, maybe that's not working so well, because I know that in certain areas it is easier for someone who presents as white to get housing than someone who presents as African American. So maybe I need to change my program so that the impact of what I'm trying to do is equitable. So that kind of analysis is looking at outcomes not just based on the number of things you did, but really looking at the impact in an equitable fashion. Before and after action reviews are often used in crisis response, which in a way is how we've all been operating for the past couple years. So where were we before the crisis and where are we after the crisis? What worked well? What do we want to keep that we changed? And how do we keep any good things going forward? Pay for success is a model the government has been trying the past few years to really compensate programs that are achieving specific measurable goals, and to when they meet a research-based goal, to compensate for the fact that they achieved those. And utilization-focused evaluation is the idea that the type of evaluation that you do is really determined by who you are evaluating and what is going to be most useful for them. So it's not as much a specific kind of evaluation, but more a context around which evaluations are created. So that is just a smidge about what could be approaches to evaluation. And that was all in the before times. All of that, all of those happy little charts and models, and those are all things that were great and are important, but the policy making and implementation and program evaluation, all of that has changed, I would say, since really of March of 2020, which is when the government first started kicking out federal money to respond, and also when policies started changing, like we talked about the lockdowns, we talked about, all kinds of just mind-blowing sorts of things, like the Center for Disease Control setting policy through a nationwide eviction moratorium. So just different players doing different things, Things happening very, very, very quickly with massive amounts of money. Nonprofits really becoming more of a partner for the federal government, and then by association, the state government, because there are so many resources available that the government doesn't have the capacity to be able to actually run the programs that through which that money has to flow. So nonprofits are raising in prominence, but also then the amount of resources available. It's not that funny a joke, but my friends and I, we used to work for the government back in the last Recovery Act. We had the help, I'm buried under a pile of money. There's too much money. I don't even know what to do with it. I can't see straight how to keep this all organized. So that is a key challenge right now. And then also figuring out now, how do we look at the impact? How do we do an evaluation within this crisis mentality, and how do we keep what's going to work? How do we keep what we like, and then peel away what's not going to work? So I do think we're going to be figuring out, all of us, the impacts of this for a long, long time. Check us back in one of these webinars 10 years from now, we can be like, what was the impact of COVID on the nonprofit sector? We'll schedule it for 10 years from now. But it's just such the reverberations of this, I just think, will be massive for a long time to come. Next slide. And then, so there's all this discussion about policies. What are they? Resources, how are things really set? I want to talk about that a little bit, because there is always a difference between what's of interest to people within the world, within a country, but where the government is compelled to do something about it. So there's an issue say, for example, the one we have here, male pattern baldness. It isn't a fatal issue, but there's all kinds of money spent on it. Research, people don't, aren't so interested in being a participant in the world of male pattern baldness. So vast amounts of resources spent, but it's not always the same with something like malaria, which has killed people all over the world, but very little is spent in the United States because it's not a huge factor here. So at some point, with the variety of issues that people spend time on, but then issues that government allocates resources to, there's factors that influence that. There are decisions made by the government. They are compelled to act on certain policies for certain reasons. And advocacy is really the way that nonprofits can draw that kind of attention to issues, to bring about the change, to be able to bring those issues to light for policymakers so they can both make policy changes and allocate resources. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Mary Paxton, to talk about advocacy and nonprofits.
Thank you, Nora. So I am Mary Paxton. I am currently the Director of Development at the ACLU of Ohio. I have over 25 years of experience in the nonprofit world with a wide range from workforce development, youth work, health and human services. And I am also a proud graduate of John Carroll's nonprofit administration program. So I was actually part of the second cohort who graduated at 2010. Next slide. And so what do we mean when we talk about advocacy? So I quickly just threw up a couple of definitions just from out in the field. So one is advocacy is speaking up, drawing the community's attention to an important issue and redirecting decision makers toward a solution. Advocacy is working with other people and organizations to make a difference. Advocacy is a process that involves a series of political actions conducted by organized citizens in order to transform power relations. The purpose of advocacy is to achieve specific changes that benefit the population involved in the process. These changes can take place in the public or private sector. Effective advocacy is conducted according to a strategic plan within a reasonable time frame. So really, essentially, what we've learned, from everyone about, nonprofit organizations, public charities exist to benefit the general public, a segment of the general public. And so, in fact, by you benefiting the public, nonprofit organizations are essentially representing the public. They're giving a voice to people who don't have a voice, or they're either amplifying the voice of people who aren't really being heard the way they should. So essentially, at some level, every nonprofit organization, according to their mission, is advocating. Next slide. And there's really 3 areas of advocacy when we look at that. One is case advocacy, issue advocacy, or policy advocacy. Case advocacy is more along the lines of case management. So like even when you think about a social worker, so it's really looking at one specific case or a family or a group and trying to address some need like rental assistance, utility assistance for someone. Issue advocacy is really about raising awareness around a broader problem, such as child abuse, domestic violence, fair housing. But it can go into policy advocacy, which is really about, as Nora has already said, is really about solutions and researching the problems, finding out their causes, and really looking at bringing not only awareness to that, but on the policy side, how do you bring about new regulations? How do you amend current regulations to make a difference around the problem that that nonprofit mission is around? Next slide. There are a variety of advocacy activities that a nonprofit organization participates in, from encouraging legislators to support or oppose certain laws, encouraging the public to contact their legislators around certain laws, looking at a candidate's platform and just informing the public about what candidates issues that they have voted on in the past. There's organizing town halls, there's writing op-eds, which your letters to your editor. There are calls for actions. And so I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but even on the next slide too, you're also looking at just whatever different education materials that you can send out there. One of the biggest differences is when you start to look at the policy advocacy part, and when you begin to meet with any branch, be it the executive branch, the judicial branch, the bureaucratic branch, and you start looking at influencing policy decisions, then that itself is actually called lobbying. And even though, next slide, even though lobbying is a form of advocacy, there's really some distinction between that. And one of the things you'll hear a lot of people in this world say is that all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. And the reason really that's for that is that, when it comes to, and Danny even mentioned that, the difference between the 501c3, which I'll get into a little bit later, and the 501c4, at the core, every nonprofit organization is really about advocating for their client, advocating around some issue there without influencing the lobby, without influencing any policy on that point. So that really just makes that advocating for them, and there's no legal restrictions on that. But when you look at actually beginning to influence the legislation in some form or matter, that is really called the lobbying piece. And as you see here on the screen, the federal government defines lobbying as, when an organization is taking a position on a policy, like say I work for the ACLU. And one of the things that we're talking about right now is abolishing the death penalty. And because we've taken a position on that, we are very vocal about that. We are vocal to our members. We are vocal to the general public. Taking that position is really a lobbying aspect of advocating. Also, when you communicate with your lawmakers, so when you begin to look at introducing a policy, when you're looking at amending a policy, and you have people in your organization who meet with lawmakers to begin to craft that language, to begin to talk about, what that looks like, the impact and the changes that could come from that, that is considered lobbying. When you tell the public, when you encourage them one way or other how to vote on an issue, that is lobbying. And when you're just advocating, you're just providing information. maybe providing information from research you've done about the impact, but in no essence are you swaying the public's opinion one way or the other. So it's really kind of bipartisan, in that way you're just providing an analysis of a policy. Or if you're looking at how a potential policy might impact your organization, that is also just considered advocating. And one of the best examples I can give for that is under the Trump administration, up under the new tax laws that were introduced in there, and they put those restrictions on, the amount of donations needed to claim that on your taxes. So when that actually, in essence, affects nonprofit organizations, because that could persuade donors not to give as much because they're not going to have as much of a tax benefit. So if you go and talk to a lawmaker about just the impact that's going to have on your organization, then that itself is not considered lobbying. Next slide. And there are really two distinct areas of lobbying. One is called grassroots. The other one is called direct. Grassroots lobbying really focuses on you influencing legislation through your general public opinion. So it's not, so you're really looking at the public and giving them information and asking them to think, give them a perspective that's opposing or supporting legislation, but you're really relying on them to help influence the decision makers in that area. And then your direct lobbying is when you're really directly attempting to influence legislation one way or the other by you communicating with different legislators, you're communicating with their staff. And so that's really biggest in that is you're really directly trying to influence one way or another a policy that's about to be implemented or voted on and put in place. Next slide. So one of the things about that you'll come across in these variety of nonprofit organizations, while everyone does advocacy at some level, everyone does not lobby. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. Some of that is that some organizations, particularly smaller nonprofit organizations, don't really understand the process behind lobbying. They don't have enough experience in that area. A lot of times, because it can take a lot of work in your staff capacity. So a lot of times, depending on the size of your organization, you may just not have the capacity to really engage in that formal lobbying. And then as Nora even explained, particularly like even look at the time of COVID, how many nonprofit organizations now are partnering at some level with a state or federal entity. And so a lot of times they're afraid to do a lobbying because they think that might hurt their partnership with whoever they're, that entity they're involved with. Next slide. So when it comes down to it, so your 501c4 is really around those social welfare. So you think about the ACLU, so we have the American Civil Liberties Union, but we also have the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation. So we have a C3 and we have a C4. One outside of when you get to that part of the lobbying, one of the biggest differences is that C4 organizations are usually those that have memberships. It's like, well, you can donate to our foundation side. You can also be a member of the ACLU. Another organization I think about is the YWCA or the YMCA. They're the same way. So they have that side, the C3, but they're also a membership-based organization. So a lot of times your C4s have that membership base, but with your C4 organization, they can participate in lobbying with no limitations at all. One of the side bars for that, though, is that their donations that they're given for their membership, or if they actually just give money for you to use outside, outside of their membership costs, those are not tax deductible. And as Danny pointed out, you can get a letter of reference that gave money to this organization, but you can't claim it on your taxes. And the other thing is that C4 organizations can participate in campaign activities with some restrictions. Next slide. So on the other hand, your 501c public charity organizations, they have limited lobbying. They cannot participate in any campaign activities. And when it comes to their lobbying, there are really two different ways that their lobbying can be tested. And so which I was actually surprised in doing this course, is that for a long time, the way they said it was that your organization could not have any substantial part of his activities be involved with lobbying. But for a long time, there was no definition of what substantial is, and that's not surprising given our government and some of their definitions around that. So you really had no real guidance on what that level is, and so that you can still participate in this test here by saying that you don't have any substantial lobbying activities, but it's really going to be up to the government to decide whether or not that is substantial or not. And in those cases, if they rule that it is substantial, there is a significant I want to say, is it 25%? I think it is, but there's a significant penalty. But the other part with this too is not just a penalty on the actual organization itself. Those executive members of the organization can also be penalized personally for having overstepped that substantial test. And then the second way that you can do it is called the expenditure test. And so essentially what this is an election that, once the organization signs up for it, you don't have to re-sign up for it. You will have to do lobbying activity reports quarterly throughout the year. But basically what this is saying, it takes your expenditures for your organization based on what your mission is, and it looks at those expenditures and it tells you what percent of those expenditures can be spent on lobbying. It's like you see here on the first line, if you have an organization that expenditures are up to $500,000, then you can actually spend up to $100,000 of that money actually on lobbying activities. And then there's a kind of a caveat here too, because when it comes to the grassroots lobbying, you can't spend more than 25% of that total amount per year on grassroots activities. So they let you have to know you can do both, but there's still a percentage in how you do both, or you can just choose to do one of them. But most organizations who actually participate in lobbying at this level and do the 501H election, they actually do a combination of both of them. And I guess I'll pause to here to see, are there any questions so far around this piece? Okay. So one of the other nice parts, and so let me go back, and I will say that if your organization happens to exceed that amount for the lobbying, the nice part about it is, and when I might be wrong, so I should have put that in my slide, but they actually, I think they look at your 3-year average of how much money you have spent on lobbying. So they don't do it year by year. I think it's either 2 or 3-year average to see how much you have spent. And at that point, they'll decide whether you have overspent your expenditures, and it's still at 25%. But if that happens, it's only the organization itself who pays the penalty. The actual, the board of directors or your executive leadership is not responsible personally for paying a penalty as well for that part of it. And then if you do go up under the 501H election, there are some lobbying exclusions. So if, like for the ACLU, they know the work that we do around criminal justice. So if we have a senator or a House representative that comes to us and say, well, we are looking at bail reform, and so we kind of want your advice, and we didn't solicit, they came to us, then that when we do unsolicited advice, that is not considered a lobbying activity. When you have communications just to say about the impact, but not, saying a supporting or opposing view for in naming a specific legislation, but you're also looking at a broader issue, then that's not considered a lobbying activity. When you provide information based on your research or any studies that you've done, and you do it in a way they say nonpartisan, but as long as you do it in a way that's not showing an opposition or support, that won't be considered lobbying. If you're looking at, so one of the things that Nora highlighted is that, once a policy is being voted upon, and then it has to be moved into the regulation stage, and the regulation stage is looking at how do you begin to implement this policy and how do you monitor. So once a policy has actually been passed through your state or federal government, and you begin to look at or work with legislators on the actual implementation process of it, then that is not considered a lobbying activity. And the self-defense is what I explained before. If there's something that's coming around a policy that's going to directly impact the mission of your nonprofit organization, and you're having discussion around that, then that's not considered lobbying. And then, like, say if you're doing a ballot initiative like same-day voter registration, and you have your volunteers out or your staff out actually collecting petitions around that, well, not staff, volunteers, if they're collecting petitions on their own time, then that volunteer time there is not considered to be a lobbying activity. Next slide. And then it was just stated as earlier too, 501c3s, you cannot participate in political campaign activities. What you can do is, like, say, if you have a candidate forum, then you would have to invite all of the candidates, like say it's a mayoral race, then you would have to invite all the candidates there. And the questions have to be more of open-ended questions when they're coming from you, and just kind of give them that wide range viewpoint. You can't know, it's up to the candidates whether or not they decide to show up. But if, as long as you have that open invitation, as long as you're given a nonpartisan, non-biased perspective of, those races, then you're allowed to, participate in that way. You just can't really endorse a candidate at all. And you have to be careful to make sure that any information that you put out is not endorsing a candidate. But you can definitely do like voter registration by drives, encourage people to vote, but you just can't endorse a political candidate. And then essentially, what happens around all of this is that when whatever your organization, whatever your mission is, you're really going to put together a plan in terms of your advocacy strategy, and that will, you'll have a lot of different things that go into that part of it. But what you really want to look at, studies show you that if you're going to have an effective policy advocacy program, as Nora pointed out, you have to understand the policy process. So as understanding who are your legislators, what viewpoints they may have on the issue area that you're looking at, who are their staff, because a lot of times you're going to build a relationship with their staff, and that's really going to be your entryway into that senator and to that representative. You're also effective when you're giving them a factual data, but not only factual data, but is one thing that Nora pointed out, but you're also sharing some lived experiences where you actually show the impact that this policy is having on whatever affected community that is. You're building really strong relationship, not just with the executive branches, but you're also building strong relationship with other organizations in your community that are also doing the same kind of work. And if you even bring in a coalition together for that, and then you just kind of want to make sure at the end of the day that your messaging is clear and concise, and that you understand who you're targeting for your message, and that you really understand how they're receiving that message, and as you understand that, so it's good to know both your supporting arguments and your opposing arguments, because that really will kind of help you craft that concise message to them. That's it. Any questions?
Thank you, Mary. Good job. All right, that is the end of our presentation for tonight. Are there any final questions? Any points you wanted to make that didn't get a chance? Any feedback for us? Well, we did want to tell you a little bit about the program. The nonprofit program is a master's degree in, obviously, nonprofit administration. This was a small sampling of our classes for this fall. We have pretty fantastic instructors, as you can see, and a mission of developing unapologetic social justice leaders. If you're interested, please reach out to me. You can reach me at drobbins@jcu.edu. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership, and please stay safe and healthy out there. Good job, team. Thank you.
Go team.